Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Welcome to Melbourne Law School and to the University of Melbourne node of the Australian Research Council's Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making and Society. My name is Jake Goldenfein. I'm an academic here at the law school and a CI in the ADM+S Centre. And I want to begin by acknowledging that this law school is on Wurundjeri land, land over which sovereignty was never ceded. And I want to pay respects to Indigenous elders and any Indigenous people who might be here today. I also want to acknowledge that this law school, Australia's oldest law school, has an historical role in the promulgation of settler law and policy and forms of expertise that have participated in the colonial project of Indigenous dispossession. I'm very excited to welcome you all here to this public lecture by Sanha Song, who I've gotten to spend some time with over the last couple of days, and it's been a true pleasure. Before we get things started, I want to tell the people on Zoom, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat and we'll do our best to get to them, but we are going to privilege questions for people who are in the room, so you can have a sort of para conversation happening if you so please. But without further ado, I'll pass over to Dr. Chris O'Neill from Monash University, who can introduce the event and introduce Sanha. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jake. Yeah, hello. So my name's Chris O'Neill. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Monash University node of the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making and Society. Just rolls trippingly off the tongue. It's really genuinely very great pleasure and very exciting to be able to welcome Dr. Sanha Hong to the centre to give this lecture tonight. I've been a great admirer of Sanha's work for years now, since at least Technologies of Speculation. Sanha's first book came out in, I think, 2020, that's right. It's a really a remarkable piece on emerging data epistemologies, sort of framed through both a kind of technical analysis and also an analysis of the Edward Snowden case, and what that reveals about emergent logics of surveillance and governmentality. Sanha is formerly a Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow at MIT. Probably I should have checked this instead of like looking over for you for every time. Formerly at MIT and is now assistant professor at Simon Fraser University in Canada. We're very, very lucky to be able to have him here in Melbourne tonight, and also for him to be able to take on a series of workshops in Sydney and Brisbane this week as well. We had a really incredible workshop this afternoon with Sanha, where, I mean, Sanha's work had a wonderful grasp both of sort of genealogy of epistemology or data epistemologies, but also really sort of profound critical and speculative quality to his work, which is really rare combination, I think. So without further ado, I will welcome Sanha to speak on predictions without futures.
Right, thank you, Chris. Thanks, Jake. Thanks, everybody, those who turned up here in Melbourne and those on Zoom. Why don't I get started straight away? I don't want to hold us back too long from dinner/drinks or whatever. So let's, yeah, if we can maximize that in some way. Yes, perfect. Okay, so I want to begin us in Sorry, if you could also move the move my face down a little bit, and yeah, people can see the little. There you go. It turns out it's 1899. This was a French postcard made for the World's Fair at Paris in 1900, and it was looking forward to what the world would be like 100 years later. You can see that this is essentially a 19th century French Roomba. It is an automated mopper and cleaner. But the most interesting part, I think, is that you still have the female maid who is expected to monitor the Roomba in some way. It's not exactly clear why she's required, but she is carrying on her existing task nonetheless. Years later, the celebrated sci-fi writer Isaac Asimov would somehow end up writing a coffee table book about these postcards. I guess he has to pay the bill somehow. And this is what he wrote next to this one, saying, I don't know how serious he was. I don't know how genuine he was about this, but he said, well, look, there was a time when we used to have human servants to do this kind of work, implying that now we don't. But maybe once the technology has sufficiently advanced, we can have mechanical servants in their stead. And again, the irony being you've still got the human servant in this particular postcard. So I think this sets the tone in a number of ways for how I think about technological futures and how technologies tend to present the future. There is a strange irony that the technology is assumed to constantly advance and get better and better. But the underlying social relations, the gender roles, the domestic work, the position of the worker seems to remain much the same. And this is something that repeats itself across the history of technology and the history of algorithms and automation themselves. This fella is Gaspar de Brony. He is an important guy in 1791. He is made the director of the French cadastre, or land survey. Boring as it may sound, this is a pretty important job because it forms a crucial basis for calculating taxation, which obviously is of quite strong importance for the newly forming French revolutionary regime. So Brony has an important job, and it's also a very difficult job in terms of data gathering. It's a colossal level of data gathering that's required, and he thinks he's got an answer. The answer is a pyramid scheme, although not as we know it. So you've got the number of people at the top here who are the expert mathematicians, and they are supposed to be the very intelligent people who create the mathematical formulas by which the whole system's going to work. But then he thought the rest of them can be less skilled and probably less paid as well. He thought you needed the second group of calculators who are converting these mathematical formulas into specific types of numbers and tables. But then most of the work could be done by the third group who would just execute the calculations. So these are the workers. So Brony has a number of assumptions or decisions going on here where he says, look, maybe we can define a small portion of the technological work or the data creation work as skilled and valuable and difficult and expert, but then maybe we can find a way to define the rest of it as something that we don't need to pay so much people, and we can treat these people pretty poorly. As it turned out, of course, a lot of these lower tier calculators ended up being women. Most famously in early 20th century Britain and a few other places where the term computer for a long time referred to these female calculators who are not always treated particularly well. What about 1822? A generation later, you have Charles Babbage, a man who is still widely celebrated, as you can see, as the father of the computer. So he is often represented as a sort of this kind of prehistoric anchoring point. Babbage is the man before the terminal. He's the man before widespread electrification, but he's the genius who invented many of the ideas that's going to pave the way for computational technologies that we know and love. And that's why children of the world today should be reading books about him and so on and so forth. In 1822, though, he's just beginning his work. He's beginning his work on what would become the super famous difference engine. And one of the reasons he was doing all of this is he wasn't really driven by some kind of pure intellectual motivation of working out the most difficult problems around technology. He explicitly explained himself that his big motivation was to create a way to maximize labor productivity at the lowest possible cost. So he thought computational technologies, or at least these early computational technologies, could essentially be used to lower wages as much as possible while raising productivity as much as possible. And he thought that the same technologies for calculation could be used to monitor the workers and enact further surveillance. He had also looked at the work of Gaspar de Brony a generation earlier, and he thought that this Brony guy was onto something, and I want to do more of it. But to find a completed version of the difference engine, we need to go to 1991, the Science Museum in London. It takes 170 years until a working version of the difference engine is actually produced. And at this point, it's more of a historical curiosity, right? You're not really going to use it in a factory or anything. And that's the thing. The French Roomba we saw before was a speculation. It was never built. It was never meant to be built. But also, we do have Roombas now, but we don't have many of the inventions that those people were speculating on in the year 1899. Brony's cadastre and the whole pyramid system was partially built and then eventually never finished. Babbage's engine was never finished either, as I just explained. So the history of these technologies is full of beginnings without ends. It's prototypes that don't always have proof. It's predictions that don't always come true. But we can see how they reference each other. They keep dreaming on the basis of each other to create a set of stories about how technology is going to be or must be in the future. So these are the kinds of questions I ask in my research. I ask questions like, why are our technological features so repetitive? Why do we have these same imaginations of the Roombas or the self-driving cars or the Mars colony again and again over the decades and even centuries? Why does this promised future stay so narrow? And then even after these predictions don't come true a lot of the time, why are they often considered inevitable and desirable, right? What does it really mean when we say we can predict the world through our algorithms and AI? And what are we doing when we have people on television telling us they're making predictions about the future of technology? So there's a kind of a relationship that I'm positing between the predictions that algorithms and AI make about us and the predictions that we make about the progress of AI and algorithms. And the more I look into these, when I look into these dynamics, you come to the conclusion that they look a lot like mythological practices. And when I say mythology, I'm not necessarily talking about superstition that is non-scientific. I'm not really working along that axis. I'm really talking about mythologies as stories that produce consensus, the stories that we tell each other to explain the world we live in, which we do in a science class as well as we do in church, as well as elsewhere in reality TV, so on and so forth, and how these stories bend political conversation or social conversation towards a set of options that we start to think are inevitable. Right. So it's this idea of why do we always end up talking about the killer robots, for example, even though we are no nearer than ever to actually creating them. So thinking about how technology produces these myths to justify its continued expansion, it helps us get closer to the real life impact that these systems have. Whereas if we simply assume that the technology proceeds in a rational way and people are always making rational decisions as to what to develop and how to develop them, we're beginning with a category error. That's like a political scientist that says, I'm going to assume from the start that politicians always believe what they say, right? And that's no way to do good political science. So one of the strategies that I take to try and understand these situations, these mythologies, is, as you've seen, by historicizing them, right? Because tech has a tendency to pretend that nothing came before it, that it's always coming up with the newest idea, and it's the first time we're hearing about it. And so if we look at some of these echoes and resonances with some of the previous times we've talked about self-driving cars or automation or AI, we start to pick up some of the patterns around how these mythologies function and what are some of the talking points that they keep coming back to. So to go on that process, let me then jump to, with apology to any historians in the room, this is not orthodox history, but I'm going to be jumping around a little bit across time and space. And so one place we can jump to is 2018, right? And so with everything we've talked about just before with labor in mind, what does it look like today? What you're seeing here is a patent that Amazon filed in 2018 for a smart wristband. These tech companies do this quite often. They'll file patents and then they may or may not develop this exact technology and deploy it. But this gives you an idea of what they're thinking about. And the idea behind this smart wristband is that when you're working in their warehouses, the wristband is going to vibrate and give you a shock, a little bit of a shock, when your hand is reaching the right bin that contains whatever you're supposed to pick, oranges, condoms, whatever. And so the idea is that it's going to give you this microsecond interference or intervention that maybe it's going to cut like 0.1 second off your action each time. They're looking for the really marginal gains. But this is also the kind of tech design that is very much in the tradition of Brony and Babbage that we've seen. It's about maximizing labor productivity at the lowest possible cost. Amazon is really interested in this kind of design because they want to squeeze labor power even more than they are doing already right now. If you look at how these workers are working in the warehouses across the world, one of the technologies that they are governed by right now is something the workers call the rate. So it's simply the rate. And the rate is just how many items you must handle per hour, right? How fast you have to pick oranges out of that box and put it in a different box. And if you fall below the rate, then you're usually fired quite quickly. Now, the interesting thing about the rate is that it's not static, but it's algorithmically adjusted. And the worker is usually not really told what the rate exactly is. So we have stories like Nantina Gonzalez, who's a sociologist, but also used to work at one of these warehouses. She talks about how when she's being trained at that warehouse, they tell her the rate is 400 picks per hour. But then at some point, a human supervisor comes along and says, don't worry about it so much. It's more like 360 around here. So the point isn't really whether it's 360 or 400 or what. You'll never know. And if you're being fired, you probably can't argue against it using any kind of evidence. So there's an illusion of there being an objective number that governs people's activity. But in practice, it's more about the manager and the company having this kind of flexible carrot/stick that they can use against the worker as they please. The consequence is that as far as the worker is concerned, their own work and life becomes less and less predictable, right? And sorry, we have an interesting overlap here, but I'll usually say what's on there. So from the corporate side, there's a huge interest in making these work routines and factories more predictable than ever through the use of algorithms and AI. But as far as the worker's concerned, that usually means that their own life becomes unpredictable. When you talk to some of these warehouse workers, some of the problems they have is when they're bending down to pick up a box, they're going to get a lot of like back injuries and muscular injuries because they do not know how heavy that box is. They are not sure what exactly it is in the box because they don't have that level of control over their own work, right? The level of fine-grained algorithmic automated adjustment going on around them means that all they know is there's a box, they have to pick it up as fast as possible, working against a mysterious rate, and they don't really get to pace themselves in a way that you might expect to do when you're working on your own. So that's 2018. But again, there's a long history of this. There's a long history of not just the technological design, but the way in which the designers of these technologies are thinking about what they want the future to be like. So if you head to 1947, a US House of Representatives committee is holding court in 1947. They have invited an ambitious, fast-talking, self-assured white guy who wants to talk to the committee about disruption. Yes, it's Frederick Taylor. I know this particular cartoon you see here is a pot shot at Fordism, but there's a little bit of a continuum here. So why is Frederick Taylor, who is later going to be very well known for Taylorism / scientific management? So of course, in his generation, he's leading the way in this kind of rationalization of work and this kind of technologization of the factory. What is he telling the House of Representatives committee? Well, he's there basically to blow his own horn. He's basically there to describe what an amazing job he's done to rationalize a factory. So we're not going to believe him all of the way, but we're going to listen to how he represents himself. He says, I go to a steelworks factory. There's one called Bethlehem Steel Factory. And he's still a young man. He volunteers, and he's sort of a rich man's kid, and he volunteers to be the gang boss. So that means you're the direct supervisor of the steel workers, the mostly male steel workers who've been doing this work for a long time. They're working on the factory floor. They have a certain amount of pride. It's a pretty difficult and complex work, but it's also physically demanding. And so they're like, what the hell is this like gee whiz white kid who thinks he knows everything? Why is he coming to be the boss of us, right? So there's this kind of antagonism to begin with. It's a very classic story. And basically, Taylor tries to get them to work harder and work faster, and they tell him to F off. And he engages in a bunch of tricks to eventually get his way, right? So he's intimidating some of these workers. He's lying to them. He's offering some of them raises to try and split them in two. He's firing a bunch of them and hiring new ones that is going to listen to him more. And eventually, he manages to get this team of steelworkers to more or less follow his direction. But what's notable here, and what was revolutionary with Taylorism, is he says, I'm not just getting them to work harder. I have come up with a more scientific way to define what he calls a fair day's work. So he's trying to say, I'm not a slave driver. I'm not just getting people to work harder. I think this is fair. So he's already doing this kind of moralizing ideological work. Now, how does he define a fair day's work? He says it's the maximum amount of work you can do without hurting yourself, but then you have to maintain that over the entire course of your career. So can you imagine working on anything as hard as you possibly can, just without injuring yourself, but then keeping up that rate hour after hour for about 50 years of your career until retirement? I don't think that's a very scientific way to define a fair day's work, but that's what he goes with, and that's how he justifies it. And so at Bethlehem Steel Company, what he does is he hires what he calls scientific managers. So these are people who are on Taylor's side. They're employed by him. They say they're experts. And they come in and they observe the steel work and then define what the fair day's work is. And they eventually come up with the figure that when you're loading pig iron, which is very difficult, very heavy, very physically demanding stuff, they said the fair day's rate is 48 tons per day. Now, that doesn't mean anything to any of us, right? But we can compare it to what the workers used to do. The existing rate was 12.5 tons. So they're suddenly coming in and saying a fair day's work is 4 times as much as you guys have been doing. And so one of the questions there is, can they do 48 tons? And the scientific managers looked and they talked to people and they observed and they said, well, they have 75 people working there already. And we think about 4 of them could manage the rate of 48 tons, right? So by their own admission, the vast majority of the steel workers cannot actually handle this rate, but this is what they go on to call a fair day's work. And that becomes enshrined, this kind of strategy becomes enshrined in what Taylor would go on to say is a scientific way of managing the workplace. So you may not have any fancy machine learning algorithms involved, but other than that, you can see that there's this continuum between these kinds of efforts at rationalizing the workplace and the kind of things that Amazon is doing today. And one of the lessons here is that it's not so much about how exactly the technology itself is designed, but it's more about who is designing the technology, who is paying for the technology, and who's making the decisions about whether you use that technology or not. So e.g. during the pandemic, if some of the students around the world are suddenly being subjected to online proctoring systems, then they're not the ones making the decision that technology is going to come in, right? So they're not usually the ones making the decisions. And so around the same time as Taylor doing all of this stuff, the steel workers and other machine shops in America are starting to experience a new fancy automated technology, which was called record playback. We don't need to know too much about exactly how that works or how the steelworks works, because a lot of factories actually refused this technology. So the developers of the technology, which was actually General Electric, they would go around to these steelwork companies, the factories, and say, do you want to buy this new thing? It's way more efficient. It's really technologically advanced. It's really going to increase your productivity. And a lot of the owners of the company are saying, it's okay, but we have some problems with it. We have the records of one company saying we don't want it despite the productivity improvement, because this technology still allows our workers to control the pace of their own work. Could you not come up with a technology that is automated, but also takes away this ability? That company is Bethlehem Steel Company. There you go, they're back again. So you have these stories where I think one of the lessons we can take away, again, is it's not so much about what the technology does that inevitably leads to a certain kind of result or takes us towards a certain kind of future, but it has a lot more to do with what kind of justifications and stories and narratives are being constructed around the technology. And of course, who is in a position to create and then accept those narratives. It's not usually the steel workers themselves. It's people like Taylor, and it's the people who own these factories, and it's maybe the people in General Electric. And so I want to get a little more into what kind of stories we're talking about here, right? So far I've talked about the familiar story of squeezing the workers, maximum productivity, lowest cost, but that's clearly not all there is to the kinds of technological futures that we hear so often about on television, on YouTube, so on and so forth. And so what are some of the ways in which technological futures get promised and depicted, and where is that coming from? Well, let's jump again to 1734. Because Paris is a new spectacle. This is Le Canard Digérateur. It is the digesting duck. It is the newest hot thing in Paris. There are pamphlets advertising this. Everyone's asking each other, have you seen the digesting duck? Oh my, you poor thing, you haven't seen it yet. You simply must. And so people are going to see this amazing new automaton created by the young and talented Jacques de Vaucanson. And the duck was amazing. The idea was that the duck was an automaton. It was an automatically acting machine, which was already all the rage in Europe at this time. And it had seemingly mastered the secrets of life. It would eat grain and then it would shit grain. It was incredible. People loved it. Now, this was, of course, an illusion, right? We don't know exactly how the illusion worked because the actual copy of the duck did not survive Vaucanson's death and so on and so forth. But the best guess we have is that Vaucanson probably inserted artificial shit pellets inside the duck beforehand. And probably, you know, stuff goes in the mouth, stuff comes out the arse, but there's probably nothing happening in between. That's probably the simplest way to make it, right? But what's really interesting is people are talking about the duck afterwards for at least a century. So even in like 1899, this is a piece in the Scientific American, people are still talking about the duck. But as I said, nobody could figure out exactly what's in the duck. But when you look at how people guess, they always seem to guess that the duck resembles a real duck in some way. Like you have these long and complicated intestines. Why would you do that if you're building an artificial duck? It's probably not very efficient. It's probably very difficult to do it. You probably just create a straight pipe at the very least. So what this tells you is less about what exactly was the duck like, but it's much more about how do we tend to imagine these technologies, and how do we tend to imagine future technologies working as well? So we have a history, a whole history of these spectacles and demonstrations and rituals that play a huge role in what kind of political and cultural conversations we end up having about killer robots or about chatbots or whatever else. And this continues, therefore, in the modern day. In 1999, Ray Kurzweil, who is one of the most famous tech future predictors around these days, and this is the book that makes him very, very famous. He publishes The Age of Spiritual Machines. One of the things that he says is that he thinks we will get real AI, what people now call artificial general intelligence, by 2029. He also said that we will soon replace writing with speech recognition, so that didn't happen on time. And he said in 1999 that the internet will continue to grow the economy at unprecedented rates. So if it's 99, this is just before the dot-com burst, okay? So this is just before the big economic crash. So, you know, he's making these predictions, and half the time he's getting it wrong. Half the time he's saying it in such a vague way that it's really hard to say whether he's got it right or wrong. That's usually how you do these prophecies. Ray Kurzweil is still going strong. Today, he runs something called Singularity University. And you know what, I'll show you. I'll let them speak for themselves.
In an age of technological disruption, where every industry, the upper end of it is like exponential technology. I've heard the buzz. What is the difference then between linear change and exponential change? Ray's third step example says it all. If you take 30 linear steps, my friend, you get to 30. That's linear, that's intuitive, that's not the world we live in today. If you take the same amount of steps exponentially, you go 2, 4, 16 by step 30. Really, in a world of doom and gloom, where it think the world is coming to hell. Yet on the back of exponential technology, we can address the grand challenges of humanity and fix the world. And this is the inspiration behind this antidote to doom and gloom thinking that says, yes, we can make this a better world.
So, you know, I used to think I was a pretty excitable fellow, but I cannot compete with the manic energies on show. And, you know, they must have done this on purpose, right? So you can see a certain kind of affective trajectory, right? There's this kind of premium on the idea of optimism, the idea that things are going to change exponentially and that they're going to fix all of the problems. So there's this kind of there's a, you know, it's a certain way to visualize how technology extends into the future, which by its own definition is very hard to prove in a rigorous and empirical manner. That's not the game that this kind of discourse or this kind of story is playing. And so, you know, like you could go through Ray Kurzweil's predictions and talk to him about how he's wrong half the time and maybe he's not trustworthy. But I think that would be to miss the point. That's not really the game that's being played. The game that's being played is it doesn't really matter if your predictions are right or wrong. What's important is to continue making the predictions, because in doing so, you're sort of setting the agenda and you're sort of orienting people's imagination and conversation to continuing to talk about these topics. And that's why we continue to hear so much about killer robots and self-driving cars and some of these other very familiar points of the technological future. The sociologist Niklas Luhmann describes this as a problem of the horizon. And I'll see if I can briefly move this particular thing. Yes, I can. And in basic terms, he's talking, I mean, think of the horizon, just the literal horizon. The funny thing about the horizon is you can never reach it by definition. It will never actually come to you. You're never touching the horizon yourself. It's not here, it's somewhere over there. But as long as you stay in the same place, you can never escape it, right? You're surrounded by it and it sort of defines the situation you're in. So he's using the horizon here as a little bit of a metaphor to talk about the role that the future tends to play in modernity. And I would say, especially with these technological discourses, it's not necessarily about the prediction coming true, but it's more about the fact that no matter what you do, there seems to be another prediction that says in 10 years or in 50 years or in 20 years that something is going to happen, and therefore you should upgrade your company's machines, or you should change your degree, or you should change your life decisions, or you should buy Bitcoin based on what's going to happen next step on the horizon. Now, as with the duck, I showed you a little bit of that importance of public spectacle and public demonstration that these things have, because it's all well and good for the predictions to not necessarily come true, but you often want your stories to have some kind of character and event and, you know, something to hang on to and make people feel like it's happening, right? And so there's a huge premium on what I would call the demonstrations and monuments of technology. And there's an increasing tendency to invest in these if you look at some of the tech elites in Silicon Valley. So I'll skip you guys, come on. And so one place we can skip to is year roughly 10,000, 2025, because that is when this clock is meant to complete a full revolution. It is called the clock of the long now, but people also call it the 10,000-year clock. It is currently being built into the West Texas mountain range. It was first envisioned in 1986, but it's still under construction. Nobody knows when it will be finished or if it will be finished. So it's kind of a parable about the technological future. Now you're wondering, why the hell is anyone building this and what is it for? It has a symbolic role. It's meant to represent technology's commitment to thinking in the really long term and tackling the biggest problems of humanity. So you see that like Singularity University language here coming back in. The clock has been enthusiastically embraced by some of the best known visionaries in Silicon Valley. Kevin Kelly, who is one of the founding editors of Wired, he loves this clock. And if you look at someone like Stuart Brand, who has been a hugely influential figure in the culture of the early web, if you read Fred Turner's book, here he is roughly dressed like a Jedi or paying pilgrimage, in their own words, to a prototype of the clock. And by the way, this incredible project is only possible because of a $42 million investment from Jeff Bezos of Amazon. So he's in the game as well, right? So the clock is very deliberately being set up as a monument. It's meant to inspire a sense of awe and destiny and, you know, like coolness. It's meant to just be cool shit, right? People are meant to look at it and go, whoa, you guys are really doing it. You guys are really doing amazing things. But we can also read the clock against the grain, right? One of the jokes around the clock is that it is unfinished, as I said. It is unvisitable. It is not open to the public. So it really is part of the horizon. It's never actually here. And the very ability to spend $42 million and counting on a definitionally useless object, I think is an interesting testament to how much power and money that some of these tech elites have been able to amass. So it's a power move. It's like the emperors of old who say, I've got so much money and power that I'm able to build these pointlessly gaudy palaces and pyramids and so on and so forth. The data critics, the critical data scholars, Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein, they coined a term called big dick data. And they give you a definition of it. They say big dick data is projects which ignore context, fetishize size, and inflate their technical and scientific capabilities. I think we could say that about many technologies, but in the clock, I think we find an analog to that, right? So in that sense, this is a multi-million-dollar phallus funded by Jeff Bezos. So this is the kind of the genre, one of the genres of demonstrations and monuments that are trying to build up a broader cultural investment in the symbolic cool of the technological future. And again, there's a number of historical resonances that we can point to. And in fact, even if you look at the history of science and technology throughout the modern period, demonstrations have a long, long history. If you look at how the scientific experiment comes to be defined, there's a demonstrative element to it, right? The whole point of a science experiment in theory is that you're able to show people the proof of your work, and then other people should be able to conduct the same experiments, so on and so forth, right? And from the very first experiment of this type, the scientists realized that this wasn't a purely intellectual affair. Scientific experiments increasingly drew a large crowd. They were seen as spectacles, amazing, delightful shows. And that presented the challenge of how do you preserve scientific integrity while making people think science is amazing and cool. So there was always this kind of competing problem. One of the examples that we have is from 1881, where Louis Pasteur is trying to demonstrate his newest scientific findings around his theory of microbes. So this is still coming in a period where talking about microbes and germs and their relationship and vaccines, it was still a fairly new and unfamiliar way of talking about the sciences around medicine and disease. And so Pasteur realized it wasn't enough just to do good science, or what he thought was good science. He had to find a way to visualize and make it into a spectacle where people would be seriously impressed. So he's really good at this. He's really good at this. He sets it all up. He invites journalists, academics, and members of the public to come to this big outdoor experimental stage. He's got two groups of sheep, and he shows everyone one group of animals being vaccinated and the other group not. And then they're both injected with cultures of live anthrax. And so the result is you see one group of sheep mostly living and one group of sheep mostly dying horribly. And so it becomes this unforgettable sight. And Pasteur understood that this is a trick where he's going to be able to rely on the journalists, especially, to spread the word and to write these really sensational stories and get illustrators to create copies, so on and so forth. And so throughout the history of science and technology, we know that cultivating this kind of public belief or public emotional relationship with technology and science has been a huge element of, again, this kind of mythological apparatus. And when we start to have theories about or stories about technology come through in the later 19th century, when people start to make these grander arguments that technology with a big T is a thing and it is a force of progress for the world, they start to enlist, again, the power of these demonstrations and spectacles. This one is an extremely well-known lithograph by John Gast called American Progress, where you can see this kind of pseudo-classical figure with drapery. And there's this kind of idea that the telegraph line and the train are the forces of inexorable white progress, upon which wake the indigenous people are sort of being driven out fearfully. And so there's this idea that this is the force of history, that this is manifest destiny, and technology is a force that's always going to sweep everything along, like it or not. And that's what leads, for example, later on still in the 20th century, to things like Futurama, which was a big multimedia installation from General Motors. And there were a number of these, especially in the 50s and 60s, right, where you had these big public exhibitions. People would come and they would supposedly experience the technology of the future, right? So, of course, some of that role is now played by the Computer Electronics Show, CES, and places like that. But the idea was that they would come and see movies and see showrooms full of underwater cities and, you know, Roombas and self-driving cars and all the stuff that we're familiar with today. So we have, again, a whole history of how these demonstrations and spectacles have tended to influence the way we talk about technology and what we consider to be plausible and inevitable. Let me just close off with a couple more scenes very quickly, because there's one aspect that I haven't talked so much about, and that is, I've talked about the horizon, I've talked about these demonstrations, and you can see how these things are designed for the masses. They're designed for the public, they're designed for us. But what about the tech elite themselves? What do they believe in? Because they are not immune to this logic of spectacle. And over the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen many of them, from Elon Musk to Jeff Bezos, become increasingly interested in this kind of mythological stories about the future. A few weeks ago, we learned that Sam Bankman-Fried, the crypto tycoon and effective altruist who is now going to jail, one of the things that he was planning when he was very rich and successful is he thought that he was going to buy the island nation of Nauru and turn it into a giant doomsday bunker for him and his friends when any kind of apocalypse hits. It's unclear how he thought he was going to buy an entire country. It's unclear if he knew anything about the history of Nauru, where, of course, a century of extensive phosphate mining first made the island very briefly rich, and then since has made the island destitute and environmentally devastated. Right now, the island is desperately poor, and one of the main sources of revenue that Nauru has is the money that the Australian government pays them per each person that Australia denies asylum to and then sends them to the detention centers in Nauru, right? But it's not just Nauru. So Sam Bankman-Fried never got to actually even start with this, but a group of other dudes have got together to begin something called Satoshi Island. So they've actually bought an island off the Vanuatuan government by a leasehold. And basically, it's this idea of a crypto paradise. You've got NFTs for citizenship. You've got NFTs for property. You've got mid-century modern living rooms that are great for Instagram. And basically, at the moment, it functions mostly like an overpriced resort, right? But you can see the stories they're telling themselves have a lot to do with the politics of exit. There's this fascination with the idea that there might be an apocalypse coming, maybe climate, maybe inequality, or maybe killer robots. And the tech elites are really into this, their own mythology, this idea that they, the smart and the rich, can escape by basically leaving the rest of the world to burn and fleeing to some of these havens. That's why Peter Thiel, for example, worked very hard years ago to get New Zealand citizenship, because they thought New Zealand is going to be one of those safer places. Presumably with Elon Musk, it's going to be going to Mars instead. So I'd like to end now with one last scene. And it is not a scene of resistance, even though there is conflict. It does not really present an alternative, even though there is a refusal. But I think it raises the question of, so what? And how are we meant to respond to these kinds of mythologies when we don't necessarily have the power to just go out there and say, hey, let's believe in something else, or hey, the rich and powerful should stop doing this immediately? That may not happen. In that case, what is the kind of response that we can have? Well, history, again, gives us an episode worth thinking about. This is 1983. This is the last one, in Toulouse. And a mysterious group called Clodo start basically burning down tech offices in the area. One office that they burned down is the French offices of Sperry, which is an American computer firm. Most of us are not familiar with the name Sperry, but they're an interesting one because soon after this attack, they would go through a hostile takeover and split into a number of different companies, one of which is Lockheed Martin, the great defense contractor today. And that's because Sperry, the computer firm, initially got rich and successful during World War II through US military contracts. And so Clodo was clearly in tune with this history when they decided to do an arson attack and burn this building down in the middle of the night. We don't think anybody was harmed. But then Clodo claimed responsibility, and they give this interview where they purport to explain what they've done. And I'll spare you the details, but you can imagine people are asking questions like, what's the good of burning down this computer center? Like, are you really going to change anything? Are you really going to fix the world? Are you really going to change the course of history? And the answer they give is interesting. They say, look, we know that it's stupid to try and turn back the clock. We're not saying we should go back to the 1890s or 1790s, or that it's necessarily going to be better. We're not saying everybody should throw out their smartphones. But what they do say is, look, it's just normal. Faced with the tools of those in power, dominated people have always used sabotage or subversion. And sometimes that involves burning offices down. Sometimes that just involves lying in some of these forms that you fill out in data entry. Some of it just involves not putting in the right thing when you're working as a data labeler for AI systems. But of course, there's the question of what does that do? Can you really win? Is real change possible? Because of course, the flip side to that question is the implication of, if not, maybe we should just give up and go with the flow. And their answer again is quite interesting. They say, look back through history, computers are basically being used by the same people for the same things. So they're not really emphasizing the fact that this is some kind of amazingly novel technology. They're actually saying, look, the technology might be new, but the patterns are very, very old. So there is no reason not to continue to sabotage these things in the same direction. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Hello? Yeah. All right. That was fantastic, Sanha. Thank you so much. It's not too far off 7, but we've got a few minutes for questions if anybody has anything they'd like to ask Sanha about the presentation. Dante?
Hey, Sanha, thank you for the lecture. I was wondering about what you would think with these sort of doomsday prophecies and everything, and the idea of constitutive failure being built into technology and algorithms, and sort of how those two concepts relate. Like, is there a way that the failure we see of algorithms to meet the expectations and the futures that they predict somehow enlivens this attitude that the end of the world is imminent and that we have to make these doomsday escapes? Is there sort of interplay there?
That's such an interesting possibility. Frankly, I hadn't thought of it that way. I think the way I had tried thinking about it is more of how are they always trying to do bootstrapping, right? So bootstrapping is a very popular term in tech, but it's also a very interesting term historically, because originally it meant trying to do something that's actually impossible. Because can you really pull yourself up by your bootstraps if you've fallen off a horse? You can't. So the original meaning of the word is trying to do something that's not possible. But eventually we've changed it to mean if you hustle hard enough, and if you talk fast and just build things, then eventually you can make it, right? And so I think one of the logics that we see is a lot of these systems will overpromise. And that's also built into how they have to get venture capital funding. And then once the technologies don't work so well, they try to create certain ways to escape the consequences of that. One of the things you can do, of course, is to do an exit, in which case you're selling the startup to a bigger company, right? And so a lot of these startups are building apps that they know will never actually be released to the public and will never actually go through that test, because you're just building it until you can persuade Google to buy it out from you, and then you can leverage that reputation into some other project. And sometimes when it is deployed, of course, what you do is you bring in a lot of low-paid people to fill in the gaps, right? And that's essentially what reinforcement learning with human feedback is right now, where a lot of these language models, they're trying to deliver on a certain promise of, AI that talks like a human being and so on and so forth. And then when they reach the limits of what they can do with present-day technology, they say, we've come up with this amazing new thing, reinforcement learning with human feedback, but that's actually the oldest technology there is, which is just get human beings to check your data and code it as that's good, that's bad, you should do it this way, you should not do it this way. And we're starting to see a lot of the journalistic coverage around how those people are treated very, very poorly, they're paid very badly, and so on and so forth. So I think the kind of strategies that are common right now is this kind of, again, the fake it till you make it strategy. But at the same time, if you're asking me about how the tech elite feel about things, I think one of the constitutive issues here is a deep ingrained suspicion of other kinds of social institutions. right? So they may believe or they may say that technology is going to fix everything, like that Singularity University, but it's also usually then bookended by the idea that the banks can't be trusted, that government can't be trusted, the universities are corrupt, the schools are corrupt. So there's this idea that none of these other institutions in our society work. So I know that's not a proper full-on answer to your question, but there's some related themes there.
From burning down a building like in Toulouse, is there evidence of a groundswell of kind of coordinated opposition or challenge to, you know, these mythologies about technology and the future? Is it, and you know?
Yeah, I mean, anytime we have these kinds of demonstrative pieces of pushback, I think people will always ask, but how many people are in Clodo, or how many people actually agree with Clodo? And that's always very hard to answer, right? Clodo insists that they represent the silent majority, but you know, people always do that. And I think, again, it comes back to this idea that, I mean, we don't need them to necessarily, what percentage of the French population should they represent for this action to be a valid form of protest? That's very hard to answer. 20%, 40%, 80%. The answer I can give is that when I look at these many different historical examples of when new technologies come along, we always find quite a lot of suspicion, doubt, pushback, and disrespect on the part of the people. And so one of the things that people say with ludism, for example, is people remember it as, oh, these people just want to go back to being prehistoric people. They just want to break all the machines, and nothing could be further from the truth, right? Historically, a lot of these ludists knew and understood technology better than the ordinary Joe. And that's why they understood how much of a threat this could be to their working conditions and their lives. And they very purposely picked which machines they're going to break. They didn't just go in for everything, just like these Clodo folks, right? I don't think the Clodo folks were against all computers in general. And so I think one of the really toxic things we have right now is when we try to be critical or thoughtful about technology, one of the rhetorical questions we get asked is, are you for AI or against AI? And that's an incoherent question, right? Nobody should be for AI or against AI 100%. We should ask the question of what are the options on what kind of AI we could have, and then how should we be navigating the choices that we have. And I think in order to make that conversation possible, sometimes it does involve active sabotage. And I think there's always more support for that than we would suspect historically.
We have, I realize we're getting close to 7, but maybe we might have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
Thank you very much for the lecture. I have a question about the relationship between science and technology, and also how science and technology should be viewed metaphysically. Metaphysics, I would define as a combination of ontology, epistemology, soteriology, and cosmology.
Not sure how to tackle that in the time that we have, actually.
Just an easy one to finish up.
Did we want to get one more question and then see if I can see what I can do just to save time, or?
Did we have any other people wanted to ask a question in the room? Yeah, okay, maybe we just take some of the questions from, do you have them?
So I mean, while we're figuring that out, I can give a really brief answer I can give there is, without getting too far into the philosophical aspect, one of the hallmarks of this kind of dreaming about the technological future that we see is almost a disavowal of complicated metaphysical questions, and then their return in the guise of thought experiments. So on one hand, a lot of these technological projects or predictions, they try to dodge the difficult metaphysical questions by saying, we don't really know what intelligence is, but we can build it, right? If I simplify things a lot. However, after that, in the popular consciousness, We see this right now when people like Sam Altman are, publicly talking about, well, what does this mean for human beings? Like, are we really whatever? Like, what are we? What are machines? And there's this kind of penchant for engaging with those questions in a really superficial way, right? Because these people haven't researched those questions necessarily, right? So it doesn't inform the design of their technologies, the metaphysical questions. They dodge it at a substantive level. However, the tech elite often engage with it as sort of a PR exercise because they know that it's a way to give a lot of gravitas to their technology, because then you can tell the public, hey, this isn't just a chatbot that we've built. This isn't just a chatbot. This is about the future of humanity, and it's about these deep philosophical questions. And so, I would say that one of the questions we face now is this kind of strategic use or even the weaponization of metaphysical questions in terms of how people talk about technological futures. So I know there's many other things we could say about that, but that's the quick answer.
Thanks, a great answer. Maybe that's a great spot to leave it on, actually. So would you join me now in a round of applause? Thanks, Sun Ha Hong.